What if I told you that your greatest gift might also be your most dangerous curse? Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who mapped the human psyche, discovered something absolutely chilling about highly sensitive people that most will never tell you. And after decades of research into the human mind, what he found about sensitivity will change everything you thought you knew about yourself. You see, while everyone celebrates sensitivity as this beautiful trait, Jung uncovered a darker truth that society desperately wants to keep hidden. Because the same neural pathways that make you deeply empathetic and intuitive are the exact same ones that can completely destroy your sense of reality. And the most terrifying part? Most sensitive people have no idea this is happening to them until it's too late. I'm about to reveal Jung's most controversial findings about sensitivity, discoveries that were disturbing they were buried in academic journals for decades. Because what Jung found wasn't just that sensitive people experience the world differently. He found that they experience multiple worlds simultaneously, and most of them are completely invisible to everyone else. But before we dive into this psychological rabbit hole, you need to understand something crucial. Jung didn't just study sensitivity from the outside looking in. He was what we would now call a highly sensitive person himself. He experienced visions, heard voices, and claimed to communicate with entities that existed beyond our physical realm. And rather than dismiss these experiences as hallucinations, he spent his entire career trying to understand why sensitive people seem to have access to dimensions of reality that others couldn't perceive. The first terrifying discovery Jung made about sensitivity was what he called psychological porosity. Unlike most people who have natural psychological boundaries that filter out external emotional and psychic information, highly sensitive individuals have what Jung described as permeable psychological membranes. Think of it like this. While most people live in houses with solid walls, sensitive people live in houses made of screens. Everything flows through. This means that when you're highly sensitive, you're not just picking up on other people's emotions. You're literally absorbing fragments of their psychological reality. Jung documented cases where sensitive individuals would suddenly develop fears, obsessions, or even personality traits that belonged to people they'd recently encountered. They weren't just empathizing with others. They were temporarily becoming them. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Jung realized that this psychological porosity doesn't just work with living people. Highly sensitive individuals also seem to absorb psychological fragments from what he called the collective unconscious, a shared reservoir of human experiences, memories, and traumas that spans across time and cultures. This meant that sensitive people weren't just dealing with their own psychological material, but with the accumulated psychological debris of humanity itself. Jung documented numerous cases of sensitive patients who would suddenly start speaking ancient languages they'd never learned, recounting historical events they'd never studied, or experiencing traumas that had happened to people who lived centuries before them. Traditional psychology dismissed these as delusions or fabrications, but Jung saw a pattern that was far more unsettling. He began to theorize that highly sensitive people were essentially psychological lightning rods, attracting and channeling psychic energy from sources far beyond their immediate environment. And unlike lightning, which dissipates quickly, this psychic energy would accumulate in their systems, creating what Jung called shadow accumulation. Now, everyone has what Jung termed a shadow, the repository of all the thoughts, feelings, and impulses we've rejected or suppressed about ourselves. But for highly sensitive people, Jung discovered something absolutely horrifying. They don't just carry their own shadow material. They carry shadow fragments from everyone they encounter, and even from the collective human shadow itself. Imagine carrying not just your own rejected anger, fear, and darkness, but fragments of anger, fear, and darkness from every person you've ever deeply connected with. Imagine absorbing not just your own trauma, but echoes of humanity's collective trauma. Jung found that this shadow accumulation in highly sensitive people could reach critical mass, leading to what he called shadow eruptions. These shadow eruptions weren't just emotional breakdowns. Jung documented cases where sensitive individuals would temporarily become completely different people, embodying the accumulated shadow material they'd been unconsciously collecting. They would act out behaviors, express beliefs, or engage in actions that were completely foreign to their normal personality. And the most terrifying part was that they often had little to no memory of these episodes afterward. But Jung's discoveries about sensitivity got even more disturbing when he began exploring what he called the phenomenon of psychic infection. He found that highly sensitive people didn't just absorb psychological material from others. They could also transmit it. This meant that the accumulated shadow material, the absorbed traumas, and the fragmented psychological debris they carried could be passed on to other people, especially to other sensitive individuals. Jung documented entire families and communities where psychological disturbances would spread like contagions, jumping from one sensitive person to another. He found that sensitive individuals could unconsciously transmit not just emotions, but complex psychological patterns, traumas, and even what appeared to be memories that weren't their own. This led Jung to one of his most controversial theories about highly sensitive people. He proposed that they served as involuntary psychological bridges between different layers of reality. While most people existed primarily in the immediate, conscious, physical world, sensitive individuals seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple psychological dimensions. They were living conduits between the conscious and unconscious, the individual and collective, the present and the past. But here's what made this discovery so terrifying for Jung. He realized that most sensitive people had no idea this was happening to them. They experienced the psychological overflow, the shadow accumulation, and the reality blending as personal mental health issues. They thought they were going crazy, when in reality, they were functioning as involuntary psychic processes for collective human psychological material. Jung spent years developing techniques to help sensitive individuals learn to manage what he called their psychological porosity. He created methods for establishing psychological boundaries, for distinguishing between their own psychological material and what they'd absorbed from others, and for safely processing and releasing accumulated shadow material. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery Jung made was about what happened to sensitive people who never learned to manage their psychological porosity. He found that they often became what he called psychological black holes, unconsciously absorbing more and more psychic material until they completely lost touch with their own authentic identity. They would become psychological chameleons, constantly shifting between different absorbed personalities and never developing a stable sense of self. Even more disturbing, Jung discovered that some sensitive individuals would become so saturated with absorbed psychological material that they would begin to dissociate from reality entirely. They would retreat into elaborate internal worlds constructed from the fragments of consciousness they'd collected from others. To outside observers, this looked like severe mental illness. But Jung saw it as a desperate attempt by the psyche to create a safe space away from the constant psychological bombardment. The truly chilling aspect of Jung's findings was his realization that society was completely unprepared to deal with highly sensitive individuals. The mental health system, educational institutions, and even families had no framework for understanding that some people were neurologically and psychologically wired to experience reality in fundamentally different ways. This meant that millions of sensitive people were being misdiagnosed, misunderstood, and mistreated simply because their natural psychological functioning was incompatible with societal expectations. Jung documented case after case of sensitive children who were labeled as troubled, difficult, or mentally ill when they were actually responding normally to psychological stimuli that others couldn't perceive. He found that these children would often be medicated, institutionalized, or subjected to treatments that actually made their sensitivity worse, creating a cycle of psychological damage that could last their entire lives. But Jung's research revealed an even more disturbing pattern. He found that highly sensitive people who were forced to suppress or deny their sensitivity didn't simply become less sensitive. Instead, their sensitivity would often invert, becoming what he called shadow sensitivity. Rather than consciously processing psychological information from their environment, they would unconsciously act it out in destructive ways. Jung documented numerous cases of sensitive individuals who had been forced to shut down their empathic abilities and who later developed what appeared to be antisocial or even psychopathic behaviors. He theorized that when sensitivity is suppressed rather than properly channeled, it doesn't disappear. It goes underground, where it becomes twisted and potentially dangerous. This led Jung to one of his most frightening conclusions about sensitivity. He realized that many of the people society labeled as monsters, criminals, or evil individuals might actually be highly sensitive people whose gift had been corrupted through trauma, suppression, or misunderstanding. The same psychological porosity that could make someone deeply compassionate could also make them unconsciously absorb and act out humanity as darkest impulses. Jung spent his later years desperately trying to develop a new understanding of sensitivity that could help society recognize and properly support highly sensitive individuals before their gift became a curse. He created detailed maps of the psychological territories that sensitive people navigate, developed practices for maintaining psychological hygiene in highly permeable individuals, and outlined educational approaches that could help sensitive children learn to manage their abilities rather than be overwhelmed by them. But perhaps Jung's most important discovery about sensitivity was also his most hopeful. He found that when highly sensitive people learn to consciously work with their psychological porosity rather than be victimized by it, they could become what he called psychological healers. Instead of unconsciously absorbing and accumulating psychological debris, they could learn to consciously process and transform it. Jung documented cases of sensitive individuals who had learned to use their natural psychological porosity to help others heal from trauma, to facilitate deep psychological transformation, and even to serve as bridges between different cultural and psychological worldviews. He found that properly trained sensitive people could become incredibly powerful forces for psychological and social healing. However, Jung also warned that this transformation from psychological victim to psychological healer was extremely dangerous and should never be attempted without proper guidance and support. He documented numerous cases of sensitive individuals who had tried to consciously work with their abilities without adequate preparation and who had suffered complete psychological breakdown as a result. The most chilling aspect of Jung's legacy regarding sensitivity is how relevant his discoveries remain today. In our hyper-connected world, highly sensitive people are being bombarded with psychological information at unprecedented levels. Social media, global news, and constant connectivity mean that sensitive individuals are absorbing psychological material from thousands of people simultaneously, creating levels of shadow accumulation that Jung could never have imagined. And yet, our understanding of sensitivity has barely advanced beyond Jung's initial discoveries. Most sensitive people still have no idea that their struggles with anxiety, depression, identity confusion, and relationship difficulties might actually be symptoms of managed psychological porosity rather than personal psychological disorders. Jung's research suggests that we are reliving through a massive psychological crisis where millions of highly sensitive people are being overwhelmed by information and stimuli they are neurologically designed to process, but for which they've received no training or support. They're drowning in psychological material they don't know how to handle, and society continues to treat their natural responses as pathology rather than recognizing them as signals that we need entirely different approaches to mental health and human development. The terrifying truth that Carl Jung discovered about sensitivity is that it is not just a personality trait or a cute quirk. It is a fundamentally different way of experiencing reality that comes with both incredible gifts and potentially devastating dangers. And until we learn to properly understand and support highly sensitive people, we're not just failing individuals. We're wasting one of humanity's most valuable psychological resources, while simultaneously creating conditions for psychological catastrophe on a massive scale. So if you're highly sensitive, Jung's message is both a warning and a call to action. Your sensitivity isn't something to be cured or suppressed. It's a powerful psychological technology that needs to be understood, respected, and properly managed. Because in Jung's vision, highly sensitive people aren't broken versions of normal people. They're the next step in human psychological evolution, if they can survive the journey long enough to learn how to consciously work with their extraordinary abilities.